Hi, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. We are getting close to the end of our course. We've come a long way. We've talked about various movements that have shaped today's world. In our last session, we talked about about Greece, and we talked about how in Greece we saw a new type of structuring for the global economy that presents new obstacles for movements, new obstacles for political activity, new obstacles for political accountability, and for normal everyday people to hold their governments to account, to force their governments to act on their own interests. What I want to talk about today is the present condition. Well, we've talked about the present condition, but a way in which we could respond to the present condition. So I want to talk about the political response to the present condition by introducing or reintroducing the concept of utopia and utopianism, or being utopian as a political strategy and as a political standpoint. So in a sense, I want to reintroduce utopias to you because I believe that the way that we understand utopias is through Hollywood, that we either understand utopia as a science fiction of something that could exist in the far, far future. And usually the utopia is usually a ruse. It's usually more a facade that quickly gives way to dystopia or dystopian reality. So that it's either something in the far future that is the dystopian masquerading as the utopian, or it's useless thought. It's useless thinking, useless in the sense that it's just being idealistic. Right? I began this course by talking about the struggle that we have today is one between a so-called reality and our dreams, or the dream world, or of what the world could look like. So I'm trying to then now come full circle back to that conversation today. So in order to first kind of start to think about it, one of the things we've talked about in this course is the interplay between power and counterpower. Remember what I said early on is that when it comes to the social sciences, there are some fundamental theorems that exist, in my view, just like there is when we talk about the physical sciences. One of those fundamental theorems in the social sciences or in the humanities, or a fundamental theorem or a fundamental understanding of us as human beings, is that you could never have power without counterpower, that the two go together, that you never have structures of domination without having resistance. If you don't see it, it's because you're not looking hard enough. It's there. So that wherever there's power, there is resistance. That power and counterpower are in a perpetual dance of control. They're constantly pushing on each other. Just like that picture, which is a picture of an Egyptian protester in 2011 in what became known as the Arab uprisings. And we've seen that in our class, this perpetual dance of control between power and resistance. So that if you look at what this chart, we began by talking about feudalism. Feudalism had its own system of control. And that system of control, however, you remember that was the extra economic coercion of the feudal lords using their means of violence to extract surplus from the peasants who had the means of subsistence. That system of control that feudalism had automatic came with resistance to that system of control. We talked about what the anti-feudal struggle looked like at that time. And out of the coming together, out of the combination on the one hand of the system of control and the resistance, out of that emerged a new system that was capitalism. That capitalism, if you remember, Silvia Federici said, was actually counter-revolution against the anti-feudal struggle, which was waging a battle against feudal elites. So that out of that interaction, we got capitalism. Capitalism then introduces its own system of control. Its system of control was through wage earning, right? So now all of a sudden, the extraction of surplus from the worker was not through means of violence per se, but was through economic coercion itself. But that system of control had resistance in it all, that it was resisted right away as well. And thus you saw capitalism expanding through colonialism and imperialism. Capitalism's expansion and colonialism was its own modality of control, which was from the get resisted as well, which then which created another system. And that system also gave us a system of control, which was also resisted right away, to bring us all the way. And this continued all the way to the current moment, because we also saw, to the current moment being that of global capitalism or of neoliberal capitalism. So that our story had within it constantly this interplay between system of control and resistance. The two are in a dialectical relationship. Dialectical relationship meaning they are contradictory forces which make up the totality, with none being able to be understood in isolation from the other. You cannot understand the system of control without understanding how it is being resisted. You cannot understand resistance without understanding the system of control it's attempting to respond to. So that in order to understand where human society is, where we are at any given moment in time, we have to understand the contradictory forces of control and resistance that make up the totality of that moment itself. So today, we are under global capitalism. Global capitalism has its own system of control. We've talked about those system of control as being neoliberal policies. Those are cutting subsidies, erasing social safety nets, privatization. That is a system of control. And there is a neoliberal governance that goes with it. We talked about this move away from collective rights, rugged individualism, the bootstrapping discourse that you see under neoliberalism, the mobility of capitalists on the one hand, and the immobility of a large section of most of workers. These are all the system of control that is now operating given global the stage of capitalism that we are under, or we are in. Well, that system of control is also being resisted too. And we are seeing that resistance in two ways. One, we have the way that we usually see resistance, which is protests as resistance. But there's also the resistance that we saw. Remember when we talked about in feudalism, that you on the one hand saw protest as resistance, these heretical movements that came about, the people rebelling against the lords, but you also saw resistance that was harder to see, foot dragging, people leaving, people acting lazy, those are harder to see as resistance, but they were also there. And today we also see similar examples of resistance by simply being in places and living in places in which being and living aren't meant to be. So that resistance occurs when you are present, merely your presence. So that it is an act of resistance when you take over a house, like it is being done in Los Angeles right now, where homeless families are taking over homes owned by the government that are empty. And people take over those homes and sit in those homes and say, look, we are under a condition of global pandemic where we are not meant, we shouldn't be going outside, and we need to practice distancing and isolation. So we're going to take over the homes that are empty, right? Their mere existence in that place is an act of resistance. Or you could talk about other places in which people are being occupied. You could talk about the case of, for example, Palestinians in occupied territories that are occupied by the state of Israel. The mere presence of Palestinians in those places and their intransigence, their unwillingness to move, is an act of resistance in itself, whether they protest or not. So that the point being that there is obvious forms of resistance, and there is resistance in which it's the mere presence of us as an act of resistance itself. So I want to explore those two options as we think through and talk about utopia as a political standpoint. So let me give you some examples of protest as resistance within the age of global capitalism. We could look in the year 2005, where you saw the emergence of an immigrant rights movement that has continued, and it gave birth to all kinds of immigration organizations and grassroots movements. In 2011, you could look at the Arab uprisings that I talked about a little bit earlier. So this is the gentleman Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, that he burned himself in a protest against police and the authorities, that then gave rise to protests all over, including Syria, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, and other places. Or you could look at the Greek protest, which we've been talking about, that starts in 2010 all the way up till 2016 and even after. Or you could look at the landless workers movements in Brazil at the same time. Or in 2011 and 2012, you could look at the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. Or at the same time, from 2011 to 2013, we had the protest, the so-called indignant movement in Spain and also in Greece. In 2013, Brazil was swept up in protesting in protesting the FIFA Confederations Cup. This picture is wrong. This is for the next slide. In 2013, there was also Black Lives Matter that began in the United States as a form of rebellion across the U.S. against what was seen as police brutality on the one hand, and the state relinquishing any obligation towards providing for people's economic and political upliftment. Or in 2018, you could look at the so-called Yellow Vest movement that swept across France in opposition to its austerity measures there. In 2019, this past year, there was protests that swept across many places. In the Middle East, you saw protests in Iraq, you saw protests in Lebanon, you also saw protests in Algeria and in other places in North Africa and the Middle East. But you also saw protests in Chile against the government and its austerity measures and the government relinquishing a lot of its investment in the public. So that you're seeing all of, and these examples of the protests that I've given you are protests where people have taken on the system of neoliberal capitalism and what it and its policies, namely the cutbacks in government support, the cutbacks in government funding for the public sector, and ideologically the retreat of the state from its social obligations. But we could also talk about right-wing protests that have been sweeping the United States, in Europe, both in Western and Eastern Europe, in places like Great Britain, where you had a radical right-wing takeover of the Conservative Party, and the people who are in charge now are part of that takeover by extreme right-wing forces. Initially was called UKIP, and they have now are in that ideology is in power in the UK. You could talk about it in Italy, where you also have the extreme right-wing takeover, in Denmark, in Hungary, and in other places, in Austria, and in other places in Europe, but also in places like in Brazil, where you have extreme right-wing forces. In India, you have a vicious nationalist party in power. In all of these different, in the Philippines, you also have an extreme right-wing government that has taken over. So there's also social turmoil, or there's also ways in which right-wing forces have taken, have used the social turmoil that has been caused by neoliberal restructuring of the economy and the government. And these right-wing forces have used the social anger and have sold their old ideas as somehow being new. In other words, what you see in a lot of these right-wing takeovers throughout the world is akin to zombies. Zombies, of course, are the living dead, right? And the living dead you see in the form of old ideas masquerading as if they have something new to say, so that they trade in old, tried and tested ideas. We see that in the United States, we see that in Europe, and we see that throughout the world. The ideas of right-wing nationalism, of marginalization of others, of scapegoating, of distraction politics, of questioning the truth, of propagating falsehood, these are all tried and tested ways. These are all tried and tested ideas. The idea of trickle-down economics, the idea that you feed the rich and somehow the rich will bestow upon the rest of us, using their own generosity, they're going to throw some wealth down to us. These are tried and tested ways. The idea that the private sector run by itself without any regulation will somehow all of a sudden start to think about and start to provide for everyone in an equitable and just manner. These are tried and tested ways, things that have not worked before, but are now being sold to us all of a sudden as if they are brand new ideas. We currently are living in the time of the walking dead. But the current moment has structural constraints as well that propel the zombies of the past on the one hand and squash or create roadblocks for new ideas to emerge. So what are those structural constraints? The structural constraints include things like the economy being transnational on the one hand, yet politics still being national. This is a structural constraint. Our politics have not caught up to where the economy is. Thus, we do not have political paths to counter where the economy is. Capital is global, yet resistance is still very national, given that politics is still national. Capital and its owners are mobile, they're malleable, they're fleeting, they shapeshift, meaning that they could move around so quickly, and they could reintroduce and remarket their branding over and over again, right? They shapeshift, they're malleable, yet resistance to the mobile capital is still national. It's not coordinated globally, and seldom is it sustained. There is lack of organization in many places. The owners of capital are global and they move easily. The owners of capital are difficult thus to hold to account because they move across boundaries, yet political movements cannot move across boundaries, across those borders. There's a lack of global transparency in who has power and how that power is practiced. It is hard to track down even the logistics network of a company. We don't know where they make certain products. We don't know how the places where they make those products, how they are treating the people who are making those products. It is hard for us to find out. And when we find out and when we track it down, the complex legal infrastructure that holds up the global marketplace is hard to operate within. And it allows for capital, it allows for these productive apparatuses to hide and to move and to evade accountability. Thus, global transparency is a problem for us. It's another structural constraint. Another structural constraint is what we talked about in the last session, where there's a separation between the political and the economic, and that the citizens only are able to operate within the political realm and are having decreasing amount of power over the economic realm, where on the other hand, the owners of capital are able to operate on the economic realm and then use their leverage economically to have a say in the political realm, so that the owners of capital are able to play in both fields, political and the economic, and thus in some ways they have the true rights of citizenship, whereas everyday citizens of any country only have access to the political realm and do not have access, or have a decreasing access, to the economic realm. In other words, the owners of capital have become citizens, and citizens have become subjects to the owners of capital. That is a structural constraint. Stephen Gill, who I've quoted from before and I've talked about before, he talks about this structural constraint. He says, quote, "What is being attempted is the creation of a political economy and a social order where public policy is premised upon the dominance of the investor and reinforcing the protection of his or her property rights." He says, look, the mobile investor has become the sovereign political subject. So that if we look at the evolution of the sovereign, we went from a time of the sovereignty of the kings to the time of authoritarian sovereignty of the authoritarian dictator in the time of 20th century fascism. We said maybe we could practice with popular sovereignty or democratic mechanisms of control. But now we are starting to see also the rise of the sovereignty of the power of the transnational investor, of the global economic elite. So the question becomes, who is the sovereign today, and how has sovereignty evolved, right? And I've said that in some ways then people and the sovereignty of people, which is definitional for democracy, meaning that people are the ones that hold power and it's the people's choice to give power to the government, that is no longer happening, or there is the cries of the people are no longer being heard as global elites now practice much more power than people across the world. So it's within this context, of this evolution of sovereignty, that where we are in today, there's really a struggle around the notion of hope itself, that there's a struggle around the thought of, is it possible to create something different? Or are we just stuck in the way that things are? And in this struggle around hope, you have what, on the one hand, what we have is the importance of hope itself, the importance of the notion that change is the only constant in human history. The idea of change as the only constant is imbued, or it's intrinsic to the notion that there is domination and resistance that are constantly pushing back and forth against each other. It's because domination and resistance are pushing back and forth against each other that you have that change occurs constantly. And given that change constantly occurs, it allows for us to be able to hope, because we understand that where we are today is not where we were yesterday, and where we will go tomorrow could be different than where we are today, because otherwise then the tomorrow is simply today. That's on the one hand. On the other hand of the struggle for hope is two things. One, that hope itself, the notion that change could occur itself, is being marketized, it's being commodified, it's being branded, and it's sold back to us as advertisement. It is in danger of losing its meaning itself. Right? That we are going to fit election cycle after election cycle, candidate after candidate, Republican and Democrat will sell themselves as, I will bring you hope and I could change the present condition. Yet they sell the same type of policies as if those policies are different than the previous iteration of their policies. And in that sense, there's a danger of disconnectedness from reality when we're talking about what hope is. So that hope is sold to us as merely a symbol. This is what I mean by saying the danger of disconnectedness from reality within a postmodern context. By postmodern here, I mean that hope is being sold to us as a brand, as a symbol, as an idea that's disconnected from actual reality. There is no substance to it. So that disconnectedness between that's what I mean by the postmodern context. So that we are merely being sold a symbol or an advertisement rather than a substance itself. That's one. The second opposition to hope is the notion that was introduced by Margaret Thatcher in in England, where she said, look, there is no alternative. Tina, there's no alternative. You're here. This is it. Francis Fukuyama, the political theorist, wrote a book. This book came out in 1992. And in the book was titled The End of History and the Last Man, in which Francis Fukuyama argued, look, there was options before. There was a struggle before between different forces, communism, capitalism, socialism, what have you. But capitalism has persevered. The notion of this liberal capitalism has persevered, and thus it ends. There is no other idea out there. We are at the pinnacle of where we need to be. This is the end of history. Yeah, you could finagle with it. You could reform this. You could change a little bit of that, but this is it. And he writes that, think about the context in which he's writing. He's writing in 1992. It's the fall of the Soviet Union. It's the opening up of Eastern European countries to capitalism. This is the moment after the demise of the Third World. It is the moment in which The human rights was redefined as individual rights as opposed to collective rights. It is the moment where the increasing population of imprisoned in the United States, especially where Black men who only 2 decades prior were asking the most radical questions from the United States, are now being increasingly imprisoned. It is the end of the 80s that saw massive covert operations throughout Latin America and Africa, and of the Iraq War and of other wars. So it's in that context that Francis Fukuyama writes this book, The End of History and the Last Man. What he is asking us, and what Margaret Thatcher is asking us when she says there is no alternative, what they're asking us to do is they're asking us to take our longing, take our desires for a better world, and they're asking us to exile those ideas, to exile those feelings, to exile that longing for a better world somewhere very far, far away, because there's no alternative. In other words, part of neoliberal capitalism, remember when I talked about neoliberalism, I said that neoliberalism is not just the goal of a world ruled by the market, protected by the government, that neoliberalism is not just a policy package of austerity and what have you, that neoliberalism is also an ideology. It's a metaphor for how you live your life, that neoliberalism wants to take you and change you as a person from being a Homo sapien to being a Homo economicus, where you become a metaphor for, you become like a corporation, where you think about everything through the metaphor of money and of exchange in the marketplace. What neoliberalism says, and this is its most powerful ideological position or standpoint, is that there is nothing outside of it. Neoliberalism says, look, we are not an ideology. What we are talking about here is objective economy, objective science, that is the economy. So that if there's nothing outside of it, that means there is no utility, there is no usefulness to imagining difference. What it's asking you to do is to narrow down your imaginative impulse, your imaginative possibilities, to narrow them down to what is practical, pragmatic, what is allowed given the budgetary constraints. To think outside of those things is to be engaged in the idealistic, the merely utopian, the realm of illusions, and it's thus to be unrealistic, to be not strategic. This is what they say usually of students. Oh, you're just a young student. You haven't really faced the world, because if you did, you would understand. This is all we got. There's no other way to organize how we live. That is the state that Avery Gordon, our facilitator in a sense, our reading for this week, calls what is happening is our longing is being exiled. This is the exile of our longing. So that what she says is, in a way, we have packed our longings, our desires, and our utopias and sent them far away, far, far away in our subconscious, so that we forget even what they are. That if I asked you, how should the world look like, it would be hard for you to figure out, that you would have to sit there and think a lot. And the reason why you have to think a lot is because you've hidden it so far away that we don't talk about it, we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to think about it, and thus it's hard for us to even conjure it up. It's so far that our longings, our desires, our utopias, when they reappear to us as ghosts. They frighten us. They haunt us in our dreams, that we are frightened by them or simply ignore them. We ignore our desires and our longings as hallucinations, as fantasies, as daydreams, as science fiction, because we are told that there's no alternative. There's nothing outside of what is possible other than how it already is structured. Look, that is important. Remember, because I said initially that the way that the subject acts on the object is based on how they perceive and feel about their position within the world itself. So let me complicate this chart that we've had that we've talked about over, several times throughout this course. So potentially this chart could be complicated, become more complicated, or we could complicate it a bit more. So the subject here, that is who we are, the agents, right? And we act on this object. Every subject, each one of us has our own subjective perceptions of how the world looks, that is colored by our own emotional experience, that is filtered through our own archives of personal traumas and joys. So that every person already comes with some feelings that are theirs, but even their own feelings have to contend with the objective, socially constructed stories that we tell ourselves, that are told to us, right? That every society also has a structure of feeling. Just like every society has a political and economic structure, every society has a socially constructed structure of feeling. In other words, that the objective conditions, how the society is structured, also entails, or those structures also try to structure your feelings as well. That's the reason why we celebrate certain holidays. That is why there are certain traditions that permeate the culture. That is why the stories that are told to you, the monuments that are built, the songs that we sing, the way that we are taught in schools, the way that we are told to be happy on a certain day and sad on another day, that these are all ways in which that our feelings are structured as well. So that what happens at any given moment in terms of the struggle between the agent and the structure is not simply a physical battle or a physical relationship, but there's also an affective battle or an affective tension between the feelings of that actor himself or herself and the socially constructed stories that encourage a certain emotional state or a certain emotional response. So that our experience and our feelings to the world have to contend with the structure of feeling that is sold to us. And then it's based off of who wins at this point that then we act on the world in a certain way. In other words, if the world is structured, if our society is structured in a way that tells us that there is no alternative, that you should be content with and be happy with the structures as they currently are. If that's the feeling that is being pushed, and then we take that on as actors, then we don't need to, no matter what is happening to us, no matter if there is an economic recession, if there is a global pandemic, or our votes are not being counted, it doesn't matter, because emotionally we feel, or the structure of feeling is, this is the end of history. There is no alternative to this, and thus we won't act any differently, and thus the structures that are currently in place are not disturbed. They remain undisturbed. So it's under this kind of analytical context that the importance of a utopian standpoint becomes important, because the utopian standpoint asks us to imagine, to, in a sense, free our imaginative abilities and our imaginative impulses to be able to see not only this world, but to be able to see how this world could be very different today. One. Two, the utopian impulse is going to tell us that the alternative is already here in the present. It's not in the future. That it's not science fiction, that the alternative exists in the here and now. So let me break that down for you by going through what Avery Gorin kind of talks to us about through the article that we all read, which was called Some Thoughts on the Utopian. So one of the things that she says is that we have focused that it's important that when we focus on the relationship of the object to the subject, that when we are looking at that relationship, that we do not overpower the object. We don't overpower the structures already in place. Because if we do that, then we render ourselves constrained by an ever-expansive object, by an ever-expansive, ever more powerful structure that is already in place. In a sense, in other words, what she is saying is that when you analyze then the current moment, don't get to that when we, as I did, I talked about how what neoliberal capitalism looks like, how it's structured around the world, the transnational accumulation regime, transnational production, the ideology, the way in which there's independent economic institutions and all of this. It seemed like such a powerful complex. And she says, in understanding the system, don't get caught up in it as well. That the system, any system throughout human history, might seem all powerful. Feudalism was all powerful. It had the means of violence, extraordinary amount of violence. But yet, it was drastically changed. It was toppled by a bunch of peasants, right? So that she says, make sure that in our analysis of structure, that we don't give it all the power in the world, because by doing so, then we are undermining the very power that we bring into the equation as the agents, right? As people. So that she says, look, quote, a belief in the power of global capitalism and its corollary orders to define the very terms, not only of what is given, but what could be given as well. Do not allow, so that the system itself should be critiqued, and we should be able to have the imaginative ability to think about the otherwise, that we are not stuck with the only option we have is not the political process or the political choices that are given to us at any given moment in time by the system that rules at any given point in time. Malcolm X would talk about this. This is a longer quote, but Malcolm X would talk about, that they constantly, this was his critique of the church, of the Black church. He would say that we are constantly told to endure the misery of today because the kingdom of God is going to be in the future. That it's in the future when we die in the afterlife that we're able to that we're going to be able to live in a place that is just, that is free. And he says that we ought to reject that. That the kingdom of God needs to be built in the here and now. That it's not in the future, but it's in the here and now that we need to live in a more just and humane society. So that Malcolm X was thinking kind of along the same lines as well when he was struggling in his life. So to go back to this exile of our longing, why this exile? There is the seeming totality of power that we can't see beyond it. That this exile, what it looks like is it looks like there is a totality of power that we can't look beyond. That there is a way that the story of power that is told, even its critics, that empower the system of power even more. That there is a long history of traumas, an archive of traumas that get passed down. Look, there's all these movements that came before us. There was the Third World Movement that we talked about. That Third World Movement was not able to accomplish its goals necessarily, all of its goals. And one of the reasons why it wasn't able to accomplish all of its goals is the violence that it had to deal with and contend with. And that violence has meant that there was a generation on generation of people that suffered through that violence, and and there was traumas that were felt by thousands, by millions of people. And that trauma is passed down generation to generation. And thus, the social effect of that trauma is that people sometimes might be afraid of taking on, or afraid of getting involved in the political process, because of the trauma that they or their parents or their grandparents experienced before, that it lives within us. And thus it allows for the perpetuation of the notion that there is no utility in confronting power, because there's no alternative. That this exile of these feelings, even though it cannot be measured, it has real material significance. Because if you do not feel like your political action could change what's going on, then you won't act. And so she says, quote, "The subjective factor, the instinct for freedom, is neither residual nor epiphenomenal. It's part of the historical material." Meaning that it's when the instinct for freedom becomes something palpable in everybody. When that feeling becomes operational, when that feeling is no longer exiled, but it lives in you in the very present. It's at that point in time when you start to see a political change. So then she says, look, our dreams, our longings, the utopia is exiled to our subconscious, deep, deep in the subconscious. And thus it haunts us because we are unfamiliar with it, because we've exiled it so far. So she says, quote, "And if the utopian then haunts, it has to be present and visible and knowable, because there is no haunting without ghosts. And ghosts are the felt sense and presence of the things, people, and knowledge which were supposed to be gone or not there. If the utopian haunts, it's disruptive and unsettling, because haunting is frightening. The haunting presence of the subversive forces and alternative values striving to become social facts is very frightening, because it is a testament to the reality of living better and otherwise than we're expected to do. That indeed can make the present waver, make it not quite what we thought it was." That our dreams, our aspirations, our ideas, our imagination of how the world could potentially look, we've poo-pooed them and exiled them so far away that when they reappear to us, they reappear as ghosts. They reappear as something that haunts us. And in that sense, it could be frightening, because what ghosts are unresolved issues from the past. Ghosts, things that haunt. When the past haunts the present, it's a way in which the things that were not resolved before kind of rupture up again today and tell us, yo, you still haven't dealt with this problem. That's why there's a ghost. That's why ghosts haunt. And we've exiled some of these things so far away that they come and they reappear to us and say, hey, you still haven't dealt with this. There's a reason why, for example, every couple of years, we see movements and outbursts around issues of racism in the United States. Those outbursts are the way in which this country is haunted by its past, by its racial past, right? By how race as a concept shaped this country. And because it hasn't been able to resolve those problems, right? I mean, think about it. In the global pandemic, the people that are suffering the most are Black folks and then brown folks. That even in a thing like the pandemic, which is threatening to all of us as human beings the same, there is a way in which the United States is structured in a way that still Black people suffer more. That is a way in which the present is haunted by the past. And even our dreams then are haunt us too. So then the question is, okay, all this stuff about exile, great. How do you unexile our longings? Should we? How can we? And here, the question of should we, the answer for me is absolutely. Yes, we need to unexile our longing. We currently live in a crisis. We lived in a crisis before the pandemic hit. And that crisis was a crisis of inequality, was a crisis in which there was massive inequality in this country and across the world, where there was increasing mobility for some and immobility for the others, where there was a divergence that was getting ever wider, where the human condition was itself subverted to market relationships. So that we live in a crisis which has now become, if we are only able to look hard enough in the current moment, has become all too visible for all of us to see. It has become all too visible to see that our humanity is being subverted to the economy, that the economy, and the economy here meaning the process by which people are able to accumulate and generate profits, has become more important than people themselves. Thus, you see people and politicians talking about, well, some people are going to die, but that's the price we got to pay for the economy to get back on its feet. But what is the economy? Why is the economy more important than human beings when the economy is something that is meant to come to help us? The economy is the way you distribute and resources, is the way you account for resources. How is the distribution of resources become more important, or the way that resources are divvied up become more important than people themselves? That is a state of crisis. So it's within that crisis that we are able to see that living could only occur through an intensification of relationships, that one must share the burden of the question of why is this life mine? And this question is one that has also become very visible for us in this current context, that in the context of living in isolation, of me here talking to you in Zoom rather than being in the classroom, this process itself, the isolation that we are facing every day today, cannot occur without the intensification of relationships that we have with each other. I cannot live in isolation here today without people being able to deliver groceries to me. I cannot live in isolation here today without healthcare workers, without nurses and caretakers healing others. That I cannot operate in isolation here today, that I cannot live healthy without you over there also taking responsibility for being socially distant and what have you. That my life is intensely related to how you live your life. So that living in crisis means that that there needs to be an intensification of the relationships between people. That otherwise we risk to revert into political depression when we do not see and do not feel and do not operate based on the idea of all of us being related to each other. Political depression is when the sense is, quote, where the sense that customary forms of political response, including direct action or critical analysis, are no longer working either to change the world or to make us feel better. In other words, when we become cynical, that power is here to stay and we can't change it. So we live in a crisis. Given that we live in a crisis, we need to figure out a way to think otherwise. And thus we need to go back to where our longings and desires are and see if we could excavate them from the depths that we've dug for them, that we've placed them in. And through that excavation, to unexile them and to bring them back to the forefront. So how do we do that? Lesson one that Gorin tells us is, quote, the utopian thinking. She says, of course, the way to do this is through utopian thinking. So what is that utopian? What is that utopianism? She says, the utopian thinking almost always begins with what you're missing and the terrible weight of loss, the exile of our longing. But you can't get very far unless you line up and draw upon whatever other resources you have for being less afraid of what you seek to know and possess. So the first thing that we ought to do, she says, is to kind of feel what we're missing and not be afraid of the weight of that loss. So what's missing in our life, in our collective life, not in your personal life? Well, maybe your personal life, but really your collective life. What's missing in it? Is what's missing a notion of collective responsibility for each other? Is that what's missing? Is what's missing a system of healthcare that treats us all as human beings who deserve to live, not based simply on if we have the money to spend on treating ourselves? Is that's what's missing? Is what's missing the notion that we shouldn't be dependent on somebody giving us a job so that we could be able to buy food and eat? Is that what's missing? Is what's missing some way, somehow, being in a place where we could have shelter without having to, even if we don't have work? Is that what's missing? What's missing? What's the thing that you've exiled? What's that terrible weight of that loss of a thing that, oh, if only that could be true. But of course that can be true. If you get rid of the second phrase, and of course that can't be true, what's the other play? What's the other thing that you would tell yourself? She says the first thing is think about what's missing. The second, she says, then there's a delicate balance between understanding and conveying the magnitude and import of long-standing, patterned, and real abusive power systems and believing in them. There's a difference between understanding power and believing in power. There is the balance between fate or faith, perhaps, and fatalism. In other words, beware of becoming invested in or in love with that which you claim to despise and which you want to go away. So that she is saying that in your analysis at any moment of the system that you are analyzing, don't fall in love with it. Don't think that it is the only that's the most important thing in the world. Don't think that the system itself is the thing that's going to give you the path through which you could resolve its problems. That sometimes, oftentimes, the path to resolve the problems within the system might be outside of the system itself. Lesson 3, she says, quote, in order to even approach utopian thinking, we have to stop associating the utopian with the impossibly idealistic, or with its evil materialist twin, the never enough, and using it as a weapon against others and ourselves. We'll have to learn to be more comfortable with bad facticity. So she's saying, get over or always push against the notion that a political solution is idealistic or impossible. Be obstinate, be stubborn about the political solution that seems to be idealistic. So I mean, think about, if you think about it, the idea that somehow, if you create a healthcare system that is based on people profiting through the system, that when you create a healthcare system in which that system is a business itself that generates profits based on the idea of healing others, that when healing or providing healthcare services is a business, that somehow that business and that system is going to actually provide health and healthy upliftment for all people, that in itself is an idealistic idea. That is, in a sense, come on, are you serious? But somehow we live in a world in which public healthcare is the thing that we are often is said that, oh, that's idealistic. Joe Biden looks down on the notion of public healthcare because, oh, that's just idealistic. We can't do that. But at the same time that that's idealistic, there is and it's just, we just don't have the money to do something like that. When the financial market requires funding or wealth, somehow that funding magically appears. And it's that she says we have to be comfortable with bad facticity, with so-called bad facts. That when it is told to us that something like healthcare is or public healthcare is too expensive, that you should be obstinate or stubborn about the notion, well, that is what is needed. That is what is desired. That is what is urgent. And it could happen. And when they say, well, there is no money for it, that's where you need to separate the factual from what is ethical or politically possible. No, there is money for it. Oh, there isn't money for it? We'll figure out a way to have money for it. So that she says it is important to dissociate or not allow yourself to be disciplined by the notion that something is not possible. That we have to change what we long for, what we hope for, to something that is a need. It is a vital need. It is an urgent need. It is an urgent need to have healthcare for anybody who needs it. It is an urgent need for to have money for everybody to pay for rent or to pay for their mortgage. It is an urgent need to have everybody have food without the requirement that they ought to work. That is an urgent need. It is an urgent need for everybody to be able to go to the best schools possible. It is an urgent need for kids to have childcare, or for parents not to have to work and be able to take care of their kids. Those are urgent needs. Those are not utopian ideals. That the utopian ideals as somehow the utopian in the future. That is what is urgently needed in the here and now. The fourth lesson, then, she says, quote, is a practical utopian consciousness is scandalous, which no doubt accounts for the tremendous repression and shame that it attracts. From this standpoint, the cultivation of the instinct for freedom is a necessary condition for effective social change, for changing our way of existence. From this standpoint, we authorize ourselves a monumental act of freedom in the authoritarian world in which we live. From this standpoint, then, the utopian is not the future as some absolute break from the past and the present out there. It is in us, a way we conceive and live in the here and now. So then she says, look, given the current conditions, if you are talking in that language, you might be called you might be called a utopian, or they might repress you, or they might shame you. And she says that we need to cultivate an instinct for freedom where, you know, these aren't kind of the alternative isn't just a play on words. The alternative isn't just a random thought experiment, but rather it is an urgent need now. But also it is about seeing that that ideal condition is not in the future as an absolute break from the past, but rather it's already here. So change and making change, resistance, or running away and creating something new are not events, right? Change and creating an alternative and living an alternative, or resistance, or being about social justice or whatever is not an event that you click attend on Facebook, or it's not a protest that you go to once. It is not a resolution that you pass in student government once. It's a way of living. It's a way of life. It's a type of modality in which you are going to judge and assess the world around you based on different set of ideals. And so she says, look, quote, the utopian exists in all those examples of the things we are and do that exceed or are just not expressions of what's dominant and dominating us. The utopian exists when there is no painful split between the dream world and the real world, when revolutionary time doesn't stop the world, but is rather a daily part of it. She says the utopian is not the future as some absolute break from the past and the present, but a way of living in the here and now. The utopian is not the exiling of our longing. It is the articulation of social movement in the general sense of the term, the ongoing building of an alternative civilization with its own reason, its own home, and its own system of value. Look, I think I've experienced this utopian in the here and now, probably in its most shallow sense. Could be in the example of, like, I've gone to protests where I'm standing next to people I don't know who they are, but in that moment of that protest, it's also, I felt it in concerts, in beautiful concerts where you are standing next to other people that you have no idea who they are, these complete strangers, and there is a collective effervescence that comes about, in which you feel like you have all of a sudden been lifted out of the normal everyday life that you have and into this other world of complete collectivity, solidarity with you and everybody around you. In the context of the protest, you and all your comrades. In the case of the concert, you and everybody else who is enjoying this experience, who is not only enjoying an experience that is external to them, but they are part of creating that experience itself. That experience could only occur because they are all there, all together, all there for the same purpose. And in that moment, if you've ever been to a good concert, you felt this. There's a sense of collective effervescence of like, wow, this is a different feeling. And then the problem is the concert leaves and then you're like, how do I get that feeling back? Right? So then you end up following the band, and the second time they announce a concert in your hometown, you're gonna like, yeah, I gotta go, because I want that feeling of that collective effervescence. It's different than listening to the song by myself. There's a way in which that is the feeling of the utopian feeling of creating another world that is already is being created in these different moments. That these protests, those pictures that I showed you, in all of those protests, the utopian existed. That alternative was being built. Some of these protests aren't over. The protest in Lebanon, the protest in Iraq, despite COVID, people are still there. People in Chile are saying that the second we are able to go back on the street, we're going to go back on the street. That is a way in which that utopian is not in the future, but is already here. And it's already being built. That the protest itself or the act of resistance itself is part of the process of creating the future. So that the future is not tomorrow, the future is already here now. It's already in the present. Just like the past is not just in the past also exists within our present because it haunts us and it's a ghost that is with us. I'll give you another example. These are pictures of in Egypt, in Cairo. These are poor folks because the government has not spent in building housing, and there's not enough housing. So what do? People build their own homes without permits or anything like that, and all of a sudden you see neighborhoods propping up. And the way they build it is they help each other in building these buildings. Or here's a picture. This is a picture in Iraq. So Iraq, the state, especially after the U.S. invasion, the U.S. never rebuilt the electrical grid that it demolished in 1991, and then in the sanctions of 13 years that it placed on Iraq, and then again it demolished once again in 2003. The United States never rebuilt or had an idea of how to rebuild the electrical grid. So people don't have electricity. Iraq, and places like Baghdad is very hot. So what do? People, through the intensification of the relationship between each other, they help each other, and they build, they support each other in building kind of an informal electrical grid. Now, these are not ideal solutions, but what you are seeing here, these are kind of the generators that they use, and these are all, what you're seeing here are all the electrical lines that connect one generator to the other, one neighbor to the other. What you're seeing in these kind of conditions, and look, these are you see the way that people live. A lot of poor folks around the world live increasingly in slum-like conditions, and slums are informal housing, and they're informal housing that had to be built because the governments across the world have not built housing as they invest more and more, or as they disinvest from the public sector. It's within those conditions that people, what they have done is they've rerouted water, they've rerouted electrical lines and other public services. And as those services are privatized, poor people basically reclaim them. In different ways, they steal them. They make them theirs. As those services are not provided, they develop other ways to get them. In other words, you start to see people find ways of making life in places where living wasn't meant to happen. Living wasn't meant to happen in slums. Living wasn't meant to happen in warlike conditions in places like Kabul in Afghanistan, or in places in northern Iraq, for example. But when you go there, you still see people living. And you see in those conditions of war where they manifest true human qualities of love, of interdependence, of help, of solidarity, of collectivity. So what that shows us is those are the actual utopian values being manifested in the very places where you're like, life isn't meant to happen. So that the utopianism that we're looking for, that intensification of social bonds, that reliance on each other, that understanding that I cannot live without necessarily your ability to live, that those already exist now. We don't need to create science fiction for the future to see them. They're already here. So how do we create the conditions in which those things don't become isolated features in certain places, but become the generalized conditions for everyone? Because we could do better. So we know that we are amidst a crisis, and so we might feel despair, but how do we make sure that our despair is not undefeated? That we're not defeated by our despair, but that somehow we are able to resemble the conditions, or we are able to have a feeling of undefeated despair, where we're able to dream and imagine alternatives. Because dreams and the imagination emerges out of movements and struggles. Thus, we must not forget about the dreams in the past, the dreams of, for example, third world movement, the dreams of the radical dreams of the heretical movements during the feudal times? How do we study them? Because even if those movements failed, they held a radical tradition that speaks to our present condition. How do we not suppress the dreams, imaginations, and the act of dreaming and imagining of others by prioritizing actions or practicalities or legislations? And we allow them to kind of marinate in those dreams and imaginations and to think about how to manifest them. To envision a process that takes seriously dreaming and imagination, because as Robin Kelly, the historian, says, quote, freedom is in the process where the act of love enables each other to dream with each other. And that act of dreaming, that act of imagining, all of those acts are very important, because then it enables you to have the political ability to see and to be able to understand when we are amidst a fork in the road. Like today, going through the pandemic, we are, as a humanity, but also as people in the United States, we are on a fork in the road. We don't have to go the way we just automatically go. We don't have to just be consumers and workers. And so it's only if we have the political imagination can we then be able to step back and say, look, there's a fork in the road. We actually could go this way or that way, or the other way. There's multiple paths forward. I'm not telling you which path to go in. I'm telling you that there are paths that you could take. So choose. Don't be taken down the road. Choose which path to take. So today we are in a forked road, and the result is not given. Elites in this country and around the world want to tell you that there's already a road. There's nothing you have to do. Just follow our lead. And I want to tell you that based on what we've seen in our class, historically and analytically, theoretically, there are multiple paths, multiple roads, and it's up to us as scholars to analyze and see the different paths that are possible. And then it's up to us as people to struggle for the path that we want to take, that we desire to take. So we'll end by saying that perhaps what we must do is to train ourselves then to see the ghosts of our exiled longings, to remember what we've longed for, that in a sense we must become sympathetic to the messages of the ghost and be steadfast in what is to be done, so that we could turn longing into needs and make dreams a lived reality. Thank you, folks.